You know, after the attacks of September 11th, the United States was suddenly facing some incredibly tough questions. Questions that really got to the heart of what the country is all about. And at the center of it all was this one massive issue. What happens when national security and the constitutional rights of your own citizens slam into each other?
So let's just cut right to it. Can the U.S. government take one of its own citizens, lock them up, and throw away the key, with no trial? This isn't some hypothetical from a law school exam. This is the exact question that landed in the lap of the Supreme Court, forcing this huge showdown between presidential power and one of our most basic rights, the right to liberty. And the answer? Well, it was going to define the rules for a whole new era.
And at the heart of this whole thing is this term enemy combatant. Now, this wasn't your standard prisoner of war. This was a new label, a new category for people the government claimed were part of hostile forces. And that label was incredibly powerful because it gave the president the authority to hold people, even American citizens, completely outside the normal justice system we're all familiar with.
So this big, abstract legal fight, it needed a human face. And that face belonged to one man, Yasser Hamdi. His case would drag this debate out of the realm of theory and into the real world.
The story really starts moving fast right after 9/11. Just a week later, Congress gives the president sweeping powers to use all necessary and appropriate force. A few months after that, Yasser Hamdi, an American citizen, is captured on the battlefield in Afghanistan. He's labeled an enemy combatant and held indefinitely. But then his father does something crucial. He files for a writ of habeas corpus. That's a foundational legal tool. It's basically telling the government, you have to go before a judge and prove why you have the right to lock this person up.
Now, you might think this whole situation was brand new, a product of the 21st century. But this core tension, it's not new at all. The Hamdi case was really just the latest, high-stakes chapter in a debate that's been going on for most of American history.
And you can really see the two sides of that debate squaring off in these two landmark cases. On one side, back in the Civil War, you have Ex parte Milligan, where the court said, loud and clear, the Constitution doesn't just get paused during a war. But then, fast forward to World War II, and you get Korematsu v. U.S. This decision argued the complete opposite, that courts should step back and let the president handle national security. It's the case that upheld the internment of Japanese Americans, a decision that's since been completely discredited. These two cases perfectly frame the conflict the court had to solve in Hamdi's case.
All right, so when the case finally gets to the Supreme Court, the arguments crystallize into these two powerful competing visions. First up, let's look at the majority opinion, written by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, which made the case for due process.
And she didn't mince words. This quote says it all. Justice O'Connor is basically saying, look, a state of war is serious, but it is not a blank check. There are lines drawn by the Constitution that the president cannot cross, especially when it comes to the rights of American citizens.
So the majority built its argument on some pretty bedrock principles. They said habeas corpus has to be there as a check on power, period. They called the right to not be locked up the most elemental liberty interest. I mean, it's the most basic freedom you can possibly have. And they gave this really stark warning. If you let the government detain its own say-so, just on its own say-so, with no oversight, you're opening the door to some serious abuse of power. For them, the bottom line was simple. A citizen has to get a real shot to fight their case.
But that view was not unanimous, not by a long shot. On the other side, you have a really powerful dissent from Justice Clarence Thomas, who laid out a forceful case for why the president needs to be in the driver's seat during a war. This quote right here gets to the absolute core of his argument. He's essentially saying that courts are just the wrong tool for this job. Decisions about war, about foreign policy, about national security, these are messy, complex, and require information that judges simply don't have. He argued these are political questions for the president and Congress, not legal questions for the judiciary to second-guess.
So for the dissent, it all boiled down to a few key things. First, protecting the nation is the government's #1 most important job. Second, the president is uniquely designed to do that job. They can be fast, they can be secret, they can be decisive in a way that no court or legislature ever could. So for Justice Thomas, the idea that a court could come in and try to balance those critical war powers against an individual's rights was just fundamentally wrong.
So you've got these two incredibly compelling but totally opposite arguments. What is a court supposed to do? Well, it had to find some kind of middle ground to strike a balance between these two powerful ideas.
And here is the verdict they came up with. The court did not say the government couldn't detain Hamdi at all. In fact, they agreed the president had the authority to do so. But, and this is the huge critical part, they ruled that a citizen couldn't just be thrown into a legal black hole. They have to be given a meaningful opportunity to argue their case in front of some kind of neutral party.
So how in the world did they land there? They used a legal framework, almost like putting weights on a scale. It's a three-factor balancing test. On one side, they put the huge weight of an individual's right to freedom. They added to that the very real risk of making a mistake, of locking up an innocent person. And on the other side of the scale, they put the government's very serious interest in keeping dangerous people off the battlefield. The final ruling was the result of that balancing act.
The final vote came in at 6-3. So, yeah, that's a clear majority that sided with Hamdi getting his day in court. But those 3 dissenting votes, that shows you just how deep and fundamental the disagreement was here. It was a win for due process for sure, but it hardly settled the underlying debate for good.
And that's really the key takeaway. The Hamdi decision wasn't the end of the story. It was more like a new chapter. It didn't magically resolve the tension between liberty and security. What it did was draw a new line in the sand and set up a new framework for how that fight would continue to be fought in the courts and in our national conversation.
Which brings us right back to that central, ongoing question. The Hamdi case gave us a crucial piece of the puzzle, but the debate is far, far from over. As new threats pop up around the world, this challenge of striking that incredibly delicate balance remains one of the most important questions a democracy like ours has to answer again and again.